Warlord Morvath laughed, the sound echoing through the cold metallic chamber like grinding tectonic plates. Suspended before him was a human, a fragile, fleshy creature from a dirt planet. But Morvath's laughter died abruptly when the creature's hands clamped onto the Dreadnought's sealed blast doors. Then, the impossible happened. The 3-foot-thick hyper-alloy began to shriek, buckle, and tear. The deep space commercial freighter Omaha was never meant for war. Originally commissioned by the Lockheed Martin Extrasolar Division as a heavy-duty hauler, the vessel was a bruised, battered workhorse of the human expansion effort. Its current payload consisted of raw iridium cores destined for General Electric's new shipyard in the Vega system. To the crew, it was a routine, mind-numbingly dull 6-month transit. To the galaxy at large, however, the Omaha was about to become the epicenter of a monumental shift in the balance of power. Chief Engineer Declan Zane wiped a smear of heavy synthetic grease from his forehead, leaning back from the primary coolant manifold. At 34, Declan was solidly built, a byproduct of growing up working in the high-gravity manufacturing yards of Earth before transitioning to zero-G repair work. He possessed the thick, dense musculature typical of humans who spent their lives wrestling with recalcitrant Caterpillar Deep Space X suits. The ship's artificial gravity was dialed up to a comfortable standard 1G, a crushing, oppressive force to almost every other spacefaring species in the Orion Cygnus arm, but merely home to the humans. "Declan, we've got a massive power spike on the long-range scanners," crackled the ship's intercom. It was Sarah Jenkins, the Omaha's navigator, her voice tight with an anxiety that cut through the background hum of the engines. "Define massive, Sarah," Declan replied, tossing his wrench into a magnetic toolkit. "Did one of the relay stations blow a fuse again?" "No," came the heavy baritone of Captain Thomas Reed, slicing into the comm channel. "It's a thermal bloom. Class 8. It's a Dreadnought, Declan, and it's not flying UN colors." Before Declan could process the impossibility of a warship in this sector, the Omaha shuddered violently. The heavy steel decking beneath his boots groaned, and the artificial gravity flickered, dropping his stomach into his shoes before snapping back to normal. The ship's klaxons began to wail, bathing the engineering bay in a frantic, pulsating red light. They had been snared by a gravitic tether. Declan scrambled up the primary access ladder, taking the rungs 3 at a time. By the time he reached the bridge, the view screen was dominated by a monstrous silhouette. It was a vessel of jagged, aggressive geometry, bristling with plasma batteries and electromagnetic shielding. The hull was painted in the dark, bruised purples and crimsons of the Xylar Empire. The Xylari were a species of apex conquerors. Towering, 4-armed reptilian insectoid hybrids, they had subjugated 3 dozen star systems through overwhelming technological superiority and sheer, terrifying mass. But the Xylari evolved on Xylar Prime, a world with a fraction of Earth's mass. Their immense size was supported by hollow, honeycombed bone structures and an atmosphere thick with buoyant gases. To them, the universe was a place of fragile things, easily broken. "They're boarding," Captain Reed said quietly, his eyes fixed on the proximity alarms flashing across his console. "They've attached breacher pods to the port side airlocks. Seal the bulkheads. Protocol Quater." "With all due respect, Captain," Declan said, his jaw tightening, "Protocol 4 is for pirates. Those are military breachers. Our bulkheads are rated for micrometeorites, not focused plasma cutters." He was right. Less than 2 minutes later, the reinforced doors of the bridge exploded inward in a shower of molten slag and white-hot sparks. Through the smoke stepped the boarding party. They were giants, each standing over 8 feet tall, clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered with personal energy fields. They didn't carry kinetic firearms. Such primitive weapons were considered barbaric and unnecessary. Instead, they wielded thermal lances and neurowhips. The humans stood no chance. Captain Reed was backhanded across the room by a casual swipe from one of the giants, his collarbone snapping audibly as he collided with the navigation console. Sarah screamed, but was quickly paralyzed by a glancing strike from a neurowhip. Declan lunged, his heavy steel wrench still gripped in his hand. He swung it with every ounce of his earthborn strength, aiming for the knee joint of the nearest Xylari soldier. The wrench connected with a sickening crack, shattering the alien's leg guard and the delicate, bird-like bone beneath. The giant shrieked, a horrific sound like tearing metal, and collapsed. But there were too many. A pulse of blinding blue light struck Declan in the chest, and his world dissolved into violent, agonizing static. When Declan's vision finally cleared, he found himself dragged by his collar through the sterile, echoing corridors of the Xylar Dreadnought, the Apex. The first thing he noticed, past the throbbing pain in his head, was the gravity. It was pathetic. He estimated it at barely 0.35 Gs. His captors moved with long, loping strides, but Declan felt like he was skipping across the surface of Earth's moon. His heavy boots barely registered on the alien decking. They were thrown into the Central Command Amphitheater, a vast room dominated by holographic strategic displays and jagged, throne-like command chairs. Sitting in the largest of these chairs was Warlord Morvath. Morvath was massive, even for a Xylari, his carapace scarred and etched with the insignias of a dozen conquered worlds. He stared down at the three humans, Reed bleeding heavily, Sarah trembling, and Declan glaring with an expression of profound disgust. "Fascinating," Morvath hissed, his translation collar spitting the words out in perfectly clipped English. "The United Nations of Earth. We have heard rumors of your expansion. We expected warriors. Instead, we find vermin. Tiny, fleshy, soft. We're a commercial vessel," Reed spat, coughing up blood. "We have no military value. The Raytheon defense grid will track your trajectory. You won't get away with this." Morvath laughed. It was a terrifying, resonant sound. "Your defense grids are blind to our cloaking fields, and your military value is non-existent, Captain. However, your political value is immense. You will serve as the perfect broadcast. Tomorrow, I will execute you on a live, unencrypted frequency. The UN will watch its citizens die, and they will know that the Xylar Empire has claimed this sector." Morvath stood, stepping down from his dais. He approached Declan, looming over him. "You broke the leg of one of my soldiers, vermin. A lucky strike with a crude implement." "Take the cuffs off," Declan growled, staring up at the Warlord. "Let's see how much luck has to do with it." Morvath's eyes narrowed. He reached out with one of his four massive hands, grabbing a solid steel rod from a nearby structural pillar. With an arrogant sneer, he clamped two hands on either end and bent it into a U shape. He threw it at Declan's feet. "You are weak, human," Morvath stated dismissively. "Your bodies are small. Your technology is primitive. You rely on heavy metals and crude combustion. You are obsolete before you have even begun." Declan looked at the bent rod. It was an impressive display of strength. But Declan noticed something. A faint, hydraulic whine. Morvath was wearing a micro-exoskeleton beneath his robes to amplify his strength. The alien wasn't strong. His suit was. "Lock them in the lower containment tier," Morvath ordered his guards, turning his back on them. "Let them contemplate their insignificance until the broadcast." The lower containment tier of the Dreadnought was a testament to Xylari arrogance. It wasn't a dungeon of solid iron and darkness. It was a brightly lit, sterile block of transparent holding cells. The Xylari relied entirely on their energy shielding. The front of Declan's cell was a shimmering, translucent barrier of highly charged plasma, designed to incinerate any organic matter that tried to pass through it. The walls, floor, and ceiling, however, were made of a pale, pearlescent material. Declan paced the cell, his mind racing. The low gravity was both a blessing and a curse. It conserved his energy, but it threw off his balance. He watched as Reed and Sarah were thrown into the adjacent cell, separated by a solid wall of the pearlescent metal. "Captain? Sarah? You guys okay?" Declan called out, pressing his ear to the wall. "I've got 2 broken ribs and a shattered collarbone," Reed's voice came back, thin and strained. "Sarah's bruised, but okay. Declan, we're dead." "You saw the size of them. You saw the ship. This is a military vessel, heavily armed. We don't have a chance." "Don't talk like that, Cap," Declan said, his hands tracing the seams of the wall. "Every machine has a weak point. I've spent my life taking machines apart. This ship is no different." Declan stopped pacing and closed his eyes, forcing himself to analyze the situation logically. He was an engineer. He needed to understand the mechanics of his prison. He looked at the plasma field. It hummed with lethal voltage. But a field that powerful required a massive amount of energy. and energy required a physical conduit. He traced the glowing edges of the field to the corners of the ceiling. There, recessed behind a heavy grate, he saw the faint blue glow of an emitter coil. He needed to get to that coil. Declan walked over to the back wall of the cell and examined the pearlescent material. He tapped it with his knuckles. It didn't ring like steel or titanium. It made a dull, flat sound. It was a composite. He remembered his time consulting for Boston Dynamics, working on blast-resistant armors for atmospheric reentry. The Xylari were obsessed with energy weapons. Their entire ship was designed to deflect lasers, plasma torpedoes, and radiation. This pearlescent wall was an ablative, crystalline composite. It was incredibly heat-resistant, designed to disperse the energy of a direct laser strike across its entire surface. But crystalline structures had a fatal flaw. They lacked tensile strength. They were brittle. They couldn't handle sheer kinetic shock. To a Xylari, whose combat doctrine completely ignored physical melee and kinetic projectiles, a crystalline wall was impenetrable. To a human from a 1G death world, who spent his Tuesdays lifting engine blocks, it was just glass waiting to be shattered. Declan backed up to the opposite side of his cell. He had about 10 feet of runway. In Earth gravity, it wouldn't be enough to build significant momentum. But here, in 0.35 Gs, he could launch himself like a cannonball. "Captain," Declan whispered urgently, "cover your ears. Sarah, get away from the shared wall." "Declan, what are you doing?" Reed asked, confusion lacing his voice. Declan didn't answer. He took a deep breath, dropping into a sprinter's stance. The adrenaline was beginning to pool in his system. Human biology is a terrifying thing. When threatened, the human endocrine system floods the bloodstream with epinephrine and norepinephrine. Heart rate skyrockets, pushing oxygen-rich blood to the major muscle groups. Pain receptors are muted. The body unlocks its emergency reserves, granting hysterical strength, the kind of strength that allows mothers to lift cars off their trapped children. Declan felt his pulse thudding in his ears. He focused entirely on the center of the crystalline wall. He exploded forward. The low gravity allowed him to cover the distance in 2 massive, leaping strides. He twisted his body midair, bringing his heavy, steel-toed work boot forward, channeling all of his mass, speed, and earth-born muscular density into a single point of impact. Crack. The sound was deafening, like a glacier snapping in half. The impact sent a shockwave through the deck. Declan bounced off the wall, landing gracefully on his feet thanks to the low gravity. He looked at the wall. A massive spider-webbing network of fractures had radiated out from the point of impact. "What the hell was that?" a Xylari guard shouted in its native clicking tongue, rushing down the corridor outside the plasma field. The guard stared in utter disbelief at the fractured wall. Such a thing was physically impossible. A human, a creature a fraction of their size, had just damaged a capital ship-grade internal bulkhead with its bare foot. Before the guard could raise the alarm, Declan backed up and charged again. This time, he didn't kick. He threw a heavy, crushing shoulder check directly into the center of the fracture. The crystalline wall shattered. Heavy shards of pearlescent material rained down as Declan tumbled through the newly created hole, landing directly on top of the plasma emitter coil in the adjacent service corridor. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the thick power cables feeding the emitter and, wrapping them around his forearms, braced his boots against the bulkhead. He roared, his back muscles bunching under his jumpsuit, and pulled. With a shower of blue sparks and the smell of ozone, the cables ripped free. The plasma field enclosing Captain Reed and Sarah flickered and died. The Xylari guard in the hallway fumbled with his thermal lance, his large, multifaceted eyes wide with a very un-Xylari emotion, terror. He raised the weapon, but Declan was already moving. He picked up a jagged 50-pound shard of the shattered wall and hurled it like a discus. In the low gravity, it flew with terrifying speed, striking the guard square in the chest. The hollow, bird-like ribs of the giant caved in with a sickening crunch, and the alien collapsed to the floor. Gasping for breath, Declan stepped out of the cell, brushing the crystalline dust from his shoulders. He looked at Reed and Sarah, who were staring at him as if he had grown a second head. "Protocol 4 is cancelled, Captain," Declan said, his eyes hard. "Let's go find the Warlord." The Dreadnought apex was in chaos. Alarms blared across the ship, entirely different from the ones that had sounded during the boarding of the Omaha. These alarms were frantic, chaotic. The internal sensors of the ship simply could not compute what was happening. A human was moving through the lower decks, bypassing security doors, not by hacking the keypads, but by literally kicking them off their hinges. Warlord Morvath stood in the central execution chamber, a vast, circular room designed for maximum theatricality. Cameras hovered in the air, primed to broadcast the deaths of the humans to the Earth defense fleets. "Report!" Morvath bellowed, his four fists slamming onto the control console. "My Warlord," a technician stammered, his mandibles clicking nervously. "The human, the large one, it has breached containment." "Impossible. The plasma field." "He bypassed the fields by destroying the internal bulkheads, sir, with his body." Morvath's blood ran cold. He had conquered species that spat acid, species that could mind control their prey, species that existed partially out of phase with reality. But he had never encountered a species that simply ignored the structural integrity of a warship through brute kinetic force. "Seal the execution chamber," Morvath ordered. "Bring the primary blast doors down. Lock them manually." The execution chamber was separated from the main corridor by a set of Titangent-class interlocking blast doors. They were 3 feet thick, forged from a heavy tungsten titanium alloy, and designed to withstand the point-blank detonation of a plasma torpedo. When they closed, a series of massive physical deadbolts slammed into place, anchoring the doors to the ship's superstructure. The doors slid shut with a heavy, final thud. The deadbolts engaged. Morvath stood behind a reinforced observation window, looking out into the corridor. The ship was dead silent, save for the hum of the engines. Then he saw him. Declan Zane walked into view, covered in sweat, grease, and the blue, luminescent blood of the Xylari guards who had tried to stop him. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a primal, feral intensity that made Morvath take an involuntary step back. Declan walked right up to the observation window. He looked at Morvath, separated by 3 feet of armor and a pane of diamond weave glass. "You said we were weak." Declan's voice came through the comms channel, dangerously calm. "You said we relied on crude combustion. On heavy metals." Declan turned his attention to the center seam of the blast doors. The Xylari had made a critical design error. Because they relied so heavily on energy fields and computer locks, their physical doors were perfectly engineered against energy blasts. But the manual override mechanism, a slight gap in the center seam, designed for heavy machinery to pry open in case of a total power failure, was exposed. To the Xylari, it was a non-issue. No biological creature in the known galaxy possessed the strength to pry open a 3-foot-thick blast door. It required a mechanical hydraulic wedge. Declan wasn't a hydraulic wedge. He was a human from Earth, running on a lethal dose of adrenaline, backed into a corner and fighting for his crew. Declan wedged his thick, grease-stained fingers into the centimeter-wide gap between the 2 massive doors. "What is the vermin doing?" Morvath whispered, genuine confusion overriding his anger. "He is trying to open the doors. He is mad." Declan planted his boots wide, finding purchase on the textured decking. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs to capacity, and locked his elbows. On Earth, gravity pulls everything down at 9.8 meters per second squared. Every step a human takes, every object they lift, requires them to fight the relentless, crushing pull of the planet. Humans had evolved incredibly dense muscle fibers, thick, calcified bones, and a connective tissue network of tendons and ligaments that acted like steel cables. Here, in 0.35 Gs, Declan weighed practically nothing, but his mass, his density, his raw kinetic potential remained exactly the same. Declan pulled. At first, nothing happened. The doors were immobile. But Declan didn't stop. He closed his eyes and unleashed everything. He roared, a guttural, terrifying sound that tore from his throat. The veins in his neck and forearms bulged, standing out like thick blue ropes against his skin. His muscles screamed as they recruited every single available fiber. Inside the observation room, Morvath watched the internal pressure gauges on the blast doors. The needle twitched. "It can't be," Morvath thought, his breath catching in his throat. "Crea." A sound echoed through the corridor. It was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. It was the sound of the tungsten titanium alloy bending. "Shoot him!" Morvath screamed to his remaining guards inside the chamber. "Open the firing ports and shoot him!" But the guards were paralyzed. They were watching a nightmare unfold. Declan's boots began to dig into the deck plates, slowly carving grooves into the metal as he pushed backward. The gap in the doors widened from a centimeter to an inch, then 2 inches. The heavy, physical deadbolts that anchored the doors began to groan under the sheer, impossible torque. They were designed to hold the doors shut against explosive pressure from the outside, not against a localized 2,000-pound pulling force tearing them apart from the center seam. Snap. The top right deadbolt sheared off completely, the sound ringing out like a cannon shot. Declan opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, his face locked in a mask of pure, unadulterated exertion. He adjusted his grip, digging his hands deeper into the widening gap, his fingers bleeding as they bit into the rough alloy. "Come on!" Declan roared to himself, his voice echoing off the walls. Snap. Snap. 2 more deadbolts gave way, the sheared metal fragments pinging violently against the walls. The heavy doors were visibly buckling now, warping inward toward Declan. The internal hydraulics, completely overwhelmed by the manual force, began to rupture, spraying highly pressurized hydraulic fluid into the air like a geyser. Morvath retreated from the glass, his 4 hands trembling. He looked at the creature on the other side. This wasn't a fleshy, fragile thing. This was a biological siege engine. A predator from a world that punished weakness with death, built by a gravity well that forged its inhabitants out of iron and spite. With one final, earth-shattering roar, Declan planted his feet and threw his entire body weight backward. The final deadbolts detonated. The center locking mechanism shredded itself into 1,000 jagged pieces. The 3-foot-thick blast doors were violently wrenched apart, stopping only when the warped, bent metal slammed into the side bulkheads. Declan stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his hands dripping with his own blood and the hydraulic fluid of the ship. He stepped over the twisted wreckage of the locking mechanism and entered the execution chamber. He locked eyes with Warlord Morvath. "You were saying," Declan rasped, his voice rough and ragged, "something about us being soft?" Warlord Morvath stumbled backward, his 4 eyes wide with a terror he had never known. The Warlord had spent his entire life commanding fear, crushing planetary uprisings from the sanitized comfort of orbital bombardment decks. Face-to-face combat was an archaic concept, a barbaric relic of unevolved species. Yet, standing before him in the shattered remains of the execution chamber's blast doors was a nightmare ripped from the primordial mud. "Execute him!" Morvath shrieked, his voice losing its imposing, synthesized baritone and pitching into a desperate insectoid chitter. The 6 remaining elite guards in the chamber snapped out of their shock. They were the pinnacle of Xylari military engineering, draped in ceremonial armor and wielding neuro-whips that could paralyze a rampaging Groxbeast with a single touch. But they had evolved to fight other low-gravity species, creatures of light bones, slow-sweeping movements, and fragile nervous systems. They did not understand the physics of a human from Earth. The nearest guard lunged, swinging the crackling blue tip of his neuro-whip in a wide, elegant arc. To Declan, the movement seemed painfully slow. In the 0.35G environment, the Xylari were buoyant, lacking the friction and traction required for rapid kinetic strikes. Declan, however, was anchored by a lifetime of compensating for a planet that constantly tried to crush him. Declan ducked beneath the whip, his heavy boots gripping the deck. He didn't just throw a punch. He launched his entire body mass into a tight, upward hook, aiming directly for the center of the giant's armored chest plate. The mathematics of the strike were devastating. In any combat scenario, the transfer of kinetic energy is defined by the formula A. K is gelijk aan wrak 1 2 mv 2 $. Declan's mass, $m, $mer, was roughly 98 kilograms. Thanks to the low gravity and the massive burst of adrenaline flooding his system, the velocity, $v, of his strike exceeded 12 meters per second. He was delivering over 7,000 joules of kinetic energy focused into the 2-inch surface area of his steel-reinforced knuckles. To a species possessing honeycombed, avian-like skeletal structures, it was the equivalent of being struck by an artillery shell. Declan's fists connected. The Xylari's energy shielding flared brilliantly and then collapsed under the sheer localized kinetic overload. The armor beneath crumpled like tin foil. The guard was lifted entirely off his feet, thrown backward through the air, and slammed into the far bulkhead with a sickening crunch. He did not get up. The remaining 5 guards froze. Their targeting computers flashed warning glyphs, utterly failing to categorize the threat level of the fleshy biped. "Don't just stand there! Tear him apart!" Morvath roared, his hands frantically dancing across the central command console, trying to activate the room's automated defense turrets. Before the guards could coordinate a second attack, the execution chamber's secondary access doors hissed open. Captain Reed and Sarah Jenkins stumbled in. Reed was pale, clutching his shattered collarbone, but Sarah's eyes were locked onto the main broadcast console, located on the raised dais next to Morvath. "Declan, keep them busy!" Sarah yelled, sprinting toward the dais. Sarah was not a soldier. She was a navigator and a communications specialist. Before signing on with the Omaha, she had spent 5 years working as a senior telemetry analyst for Palantir Technologies, optimizing deep space data packets for the United Nations Naval Command. She recognized the Xylari broadcast architecture immediately. It was a brute force transmission system, relying on overwhelming signal strength rather than complex encryption. It was essentially a massive, unshielded router. Declan cracked his neck. With pleasure, he charged the remaining guards. He didn't bother with martial arts or complex tactics. He fought like a barroom brawler who had suddenly been granted superpowers. He grabbed the nearest guard by its intricate ceremonial belt and, using his superior leverage, simply hurled the 8-foot alien into 2 of its comrades like a massive bowling ball. A heavy plasma bolt from one of the automated ceiling turrets suddenly seared through the air, grazing Declan's shoulder. The heat was immense, instantly cauterizing the flesh and burning away his jumpsuit. Declan grunted, diving behind a fallen pillar of ablative crystal. "Sarah! The guns!" Declan shouted over the whine of the charging turrets. "I'm on it!" Sarah slid behind the secondary console, her fingers flying across the alien glyphs. The interface was foreign, but the underlying logic of data transmission was universal. She accessed the primary data node, bridging the alien hardware with her own personal datapad, using a crude but effective localized hack she had learned studying Cisco network exploits. Accessing root directory, bypassing optical relays, overriding turret targeting protocols. The automated turrets above spun wildly, their targeting lasers painting the room before shutting down with a heavy, metallic clank. "Got the guns!" Sarah yelled. "And I've got the broadcast feed!" Morvath had it dialed to a wideband burst on UN frequencies. He wanted Earth to watch us die. "Reverse it," Captain Reed growled, leaning heavily against the console, his face slick with sweat. "Open the channel. Let Earth see this." Sarah bypassed the final security gate. She engaged the camera drones hovering in the corners of the room, linking their feed to the primary transmitter. The massive holographic display above them flashed from an aggressive, pulsing red to a steady, broadcast blue. Across the Orion Cygnus arm, thousands of UN command centers, orbital stations, and civilian hubs suddenly found their screens hijacked. The broadcast Morvath had intended to use to demoralize humanity was live. But humanity did not see the execution of 3 helpless crew members. Instead, the trillions of citizens of the United Nations of Earth watched a live feed of Declan Zane, bleeding, bruised, and covered in engine grease, lifting an 8-foot alien conqueror over his head and tossing him across the room. Warlord Morvath looked at the blue broadcast light. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped his hearts. His entire empire was built on the myth of absolute, terrifying invincibility. And now the entire galaxy was watching him lose a fistfight to a mechanic. "Enough!" Morvath bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber. He ripped the ceremonial robes from his body, revealing the heavy combat exoskeleton beneath. It was a formidable piece of machinery, forged from black hyperalloy and pulsing with concentrated plasma lines. Unlike his soldiers, Morvath was prepared for close quarters engagement. The exoskeleton engaged with a loud hydraulic whine. Morvath leaped from the dais, the suit's artificial gravity dampeners allowing him to slam into the deck with crushing force. He swung one of his 4 massive, metal-clad fists at Declan. Declan barely had time to cross his arms before the blow landed. The impact was like being hit by a speeding truck. Declan was thrown backward, skidding violently across the smooth decking and crashing into the shattered remnants of the blast doors. His breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp. "You think you can challenge a warlord of the Xylar Empire?" Morvath sneered, stalking forward, the heavy servos in his legs hissing with each step. "Your strength is a biological anomaly, human. My strength is engineered perfection." Declan spat a glob of blood onto the floor and slowly pushed himself up. His arms throbbed, and he was certain one of his forearms was fractured. He looked at the exoskeleton. It was impressive, far beyond the clunky industrial lifters he was used to repairing. But, as an engineer, Declan knew that complexity bred vulnerability. The Xylari suit used pressurized plasma fluid to drive its artificial muscles. It was incredibly powerful, but plasma was volatile. It required heavy magnetic containment fields at the joints to keep the fluid stable during rapid movement. "Engineered perfection?" Declan mocked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Looks like a knockoff of an old Caterpillar P 5000 power loader. And a cheap one, at that." Morvath roared and charged again, all four arms raised to deliver a pulverizing downward strike. Declan didn't block this time. He waited until the last possible fraction of a second, relying on the predictable, heavy momentum of the alien warlord. As Morvath brought his fist down, Declan dropped entirely to the floor, sliding beneath the warlord's guard. As he slid past Morvath's heavy legs, Declan brought his steel-toed boot up in a brutal, sweeping kick, targeting the magnetic containment ring at the back of the exoskeleton's left knee joint. Crack. The precision of the strike was absolute. The steel toe shattered the protective housing of the containment ring. Instantly, the magnetic field collapsed. The highly pressurized plasma fluid inside the joint lost its containment and violently expanded. The knee actuator exploded in a geyser of blue fire and superheated fluid. Warlord Morvath shrieked as the intense heat scorched his leg through the armor. The exoskeleton, now missing a crucial point of leverage, critically failed to balance its heavy upper mass. Morvath crashed to the deck, a tangled heap of hissing metal and alien limbs. Declan scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. He walked over to the fallen warlord. The alien was thrashing, trying to use his upper arms to push himself up, but the suit's internal diagnostics had thrown it into a hard system lock to prevent further plasma leaks. He was trapped in his own armor. Declan stepped on the center of the warlord's chest plate, pinning him to the floor. He looked up at the camera drones, which were perfectly framing the shot. "Captain Reed," Declan called out, not taking his eyes off the warlord, "is the comm channel still open to UN Fleet Command?" "It's open, Declan," Reed said, a grin breaking through the pain on his face. "The whole galaxy is watching." Declan looked down at Morvath. The alien's mandibles were trembling. The myth was broken. The conqueror was conquered. "This is Declan Zane, chief engineer of the commercial freighter Omaha," Declan said, his voice carrying loud and clear over the broadcast. "To the Xylar Empire, your warlord has fallen. Your Dreadnought is currently under human control. If you have any more ships in this sector, I suggest you turn them around, because if you want this ship back, you're going to have to send someone who actually knows how to fight." Silence reigned in the execution chamber. Suddenly, Sarah's console lit up with a barrage of incoming proximity alerts. "Declan, we have massive slipspace ruptures directly off our port bow," Sarah yelled, her hands flying over the readouts. "Signatures are matching. Oh, thank God." Outside the viewport, the black void of space tore open. Brilliant flashes of Cherenkov radiation illuminated the darkness as a dozen massive warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel. They were sleek, brutalist, and painted in the dark, non-reflective grays of the United Nations Space Command. Leading the formation was a massive Northrop Grumman Aegis-class heavy cruiser, its railgun batteries already charging and locking onto the crippled Xylar Dreadnought. "UNSC Vengeance to unidentified Xylar vessel." A crisp human voice crackled over the ship's internal comms. "Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. We are tracking your live broadcast. If a single hair on the head of those human hostages is harmed, we will turn your ship into a debris field." Captain Reed keyed the comms. "UNSC Vengeance, this is Captain Reed of the Omaha. You don't need to board us. The ship is already secured. We've captured the warlord." There was a long, stunned pause on the other end of the line. "Copy that, Omaha. Deploying extraction shuttles." Declan stepped off Morvath's chest. The adrenaline was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at his bruised, bloody hands, the knuckles split from shattering armor and tearing open blast doors. He walked over to Sarah and Reed, slumping against the console next to them. The arrival of the UN fleet signaled the end of the Xylar Empire's undisputed reign of terror. In a single afternoon, a commercial freighter crew had not only survived an encounter with the galaxy's most feared apex predators, but they had fundamentally dismantled the psychological warfare that the Empire relied upon. The Xylari believed they were untouchable because their technology allowed them to ignore the physical realities of combat. But they had forgotten the fundamental truth of the universe. Shields fail. Energy fields collapse, complex machinery breaks. And when all the fancy technology is stripped away, what remains is the raw, undeniable math of mass, density, and kinetic force. The humans of Earth didn't need to conquer the galaxy to prove their strength. They carried the crushing gravity of their homeworld in their bones. A silent, dormant power waiting for the moment an arrogant warlord made the mistake of locking them in a room. As the UN Marines breached the execution chamber, heavily armed and sweeping the room with assault rifles, they stopped in their tracks. They looked at the shattered blast doors, the destroyed automated turrets, the groaning warlord trapped in his own exploding armor, and finally, at the human engineer sitting on the floor, casually wiping grease onto his ruined jumpsuit. Declan looked up at the stunned Marines and offered a tired smile. "Next time," Declan said, "send a tow truck. The engines on this thing are a mess." And that's how a simple mechanic from Earth proved that you don't need plasma weapons or energy shields to break an empire sometimes. You just need the crushing gravity of a death world and a lot of adrenaline. What did you think of Declan's insane display of human strength? If you loved seeing humanity humble the mighty Xylar Empire, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY adventures.
Hi, my name is Tran Truong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, the Warlord laughed at the tiny human until it ripped the Dreadnought's doors open. HFY Sci, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the biggest feeling was satisfaction. I enjoyed how the story turned confidence into humility, showing that underestimating someone can become the biggest mistake of all. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about determination, quick thinking, and refusing to give up when the odds looked impossible. I'm curious which moment stood out most to you. Was it Declan breaking out of captivity, tearing open the blast doors, or the final confrontation with the Warlord? And if you had been part of the Omaha crew, what would have been your first move after realizing escape was still possible? One lesson I took from this story is that people often have strengths that aren't obvious at first glance. In everyday life, taking the time to understand someone before judging them can make a real difference. If this adventure entertained you or left you with something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories about resilience, ingenuity, and human determination, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you think it's worth your time.